Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Katrina Bowden is stranded in the ocean, all the while being followed by a pair of sharks in Great White. Kaz and Charlie, played by Katrina Bowden and Aaron Jakubenko, run a small air charter company struggling to stay afloat. They take a booking from holidaymakers Yoshi and his wife Michelle, played by Tim Kano and Kimi Sukakoshi, to fly them to the remote Hell's Reef, nicknamed after a shipwreck where 8 men spent 15 days stranded with only one survivor, Michelle's recently deceased grandfather, and she has come to scour his ashes there. After finding a shark-mauled body, Charlie flies a search for any survivors when a shark attacks and sinks their seaplane, leaving everyone floating in a life raft, followed by 2 hungry great whites. In 1975, Jaws made people terrified to step into the water as the first official blockbuster, but it also set out the template for the shark movie, or more specifically, the creature feature in general, as numerous films copied its plot by replacing the shark with another animal, like a bear, or an alligator, or in some cases just straight up ripping it off. Jaws of course got its own inferior sequels, each more ridiculous than the last, which pretty much set out the trajectory of the subgenre. Yes, every so often we get a serious shark movie like Open Water, or The Reef, or most recently The Shallows, but otherwise the shark movie has embraced its campier, sillier tendencies, especially in combination with the fact that audiences are increasingly aware that this really isn't how sharks act, and this has culminated in stuff like Sharknado, which has just pretty much poisoned the well with irony. Since that point, there have been numerous low-budget movies with people just filming at the weekend near a body of water and some off-the-shelf CGI sharks, and then they just slap it onto Amazon with a punny title, thinking that they can be the successor to Sharknado's crown. So, in the light of that, it's actually somewhat surprising that the Australian film Great White is so straight-laced as it is. This really is completely without any semblance of irony. This is as right down the middle as you could expect for this kind of movie. Now, some of the publicity for this movie claims it's from the makers of 47 Meters Down, a surprise shark movie hit a few years ago. That's actually not the case. That's a bit of a lie. No one who worked on this movie worked on 47 Meters Down, but the UK distributor Altitude were the ones that also released 47 Meters Down, so when they say makers, they mean themselves as distributors. Naughty, naughty. What Great White is actually from is the makers of last year's Crocodile sequel, Blackwater Abyss. And you would think, given it's such a by-the-book shark movie, that would actually feel refreshing because of years of comedy takes on this kind of material. Until you actually sit down to watch it. The film opens in exactly the way you would expect it to, namely a pair of ill-fated holidaymakers getting attacked by a shark in a pre-title sequence. That's the sort of thing that immediately lets you know that you're watching something formulaic, but there's nothing too terribly wrong with it if you do it effectively. And it looks like, early on, Great White is actually setting things up. You've got characters being introduced and their relationships and individual subplots, and it looks like it might actually be doing something with them. You got the fact that Kaz announcing early on that she's pregnant, Kaz and Charlie are trying to keep their business alive, you've got the whole subplot with Michelle's grandfather, which is the reason why she's visiting the reef in the first place, and you would think, in the case of the latter, that that would be something that they would heavily lean upon, especially because the fact that he got stranded is what's going to happen to the character later on, so that she would have some kind of connection to those past events and feel what her grandfather went through in some way and draw up those parallels. That would be things that an actual story would do. The problem is that Great White has an opening act and it doesn't have virtually anything else after that. The plot kicks in, but the story comes to a grinding halt from that point forward. It is all set up, virtually no payoff. The movie very quickly betrays that actually it has no interest in these characters all their individual dramas, aside from occasionally just for plot reasons. For example, take Kaz's pregnancy. That is a cheap shot. It has virtually no bearing on the movie whatsoever. You would think something like that would dictate the character's choices and actions, that she would be protective of herself and Charlie as would-be expectant parents. But there are several moments in this movie where she jumps into the water with no regard for her own safety, which makes no sense in this context, except for the fact that if you removed all this stuff from the movie, it would make not a jot to it whatsoever. Aside from a couple of passing references, it has no impact on the storyline or the character's actions, and that's because this is a transparent attempt at trying to wring just that tiny bit more tension out of the audience, because when we know she's in danger, the audience can go, oh, but she's pregnant, get out of the water, get out of the water, and not because we actually genuinely care about the character. And the same goes for Michelle's grandfather. You would think, given that such a substantial subplot, that would get a major payoff in the movie, and it would be a big emotional moment. And it would if you actually knew how to write a script, but instead in Great White, it's just kind of left hanging, and then when it finally gets resolved, it's just shrugged off. There's no impact to it whatsoever. It's clear that the setup is just there to get the characters to the reef, and that's it. It's so obvious that the movie has no interest in following through in anything it establishes in virtually the first 20 minutes of the movie, aside from the fact that Charlie was previously attacked by a shark. He's got a scar on his leg from where he was bitten, and so there are several moments where the movie can do a cheap jump scare moment by cutting to flashbacks over and over again. That part is very interesting, because at least it gets a shark into the movie. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking, Matthew, get to the sharks already! Well, you're going to be saying that about the movie itself. Despite the title, Great White has a curious lack of great white action. And you might think, oh, when they're playing the Spielberg card, they're using the shark as minimally as possible to build up the suspense, and when it does show up, it makes a big impact. To which I would counter, no, they're using the shark as minimally as possible because they've got a tiny effects budget. And to the film's credit, the CGI shark isn't too bad looking. It's certainly not the worst I've ever seen, but you only see it in a couple of shots in each sequence, and so you can tell that they're really trying to hold back on showing the shark as much as possible. Occasionally they'll use some stock footage, but it's used so sparingly that there really isn't a lot of actual action that the audience has come here to see from the sharks. Occasionally you might glimpse them in a fin above the surface, or if you're really lucky, you might see the shadows of them in very, very distant shots. Up until the finale of the movie, that's pretty much your entire lot. And when it comes to the shark attacks themselves, they're actually remarkably tame. There is a little bit of blood every so often, but most of it is characters suddenly getting yanked off, and then we never see them again. And you don't even get to see the sharks in those sequences for the most part. They're often constructed in ways that are deliberately designed to make sure that the sharks are hidden from camera view as much as possible, even in the midst of attack. When the sharks do actually appear, they are just absolutely ridiculous in terms of their behaviour. I know that shark movies are not really close to how sharks behave in real life, where if you get bitten by a shark, it's normally because you were quite unlucky and the shark was curious. In this movie, the sharks are like human-seeking torpedoes going after them for days at a time. The movie actually tries to pin this very briefly on global warming or some other weird explanation for why the sharks are acting so badly, which just makes it even more ridiculous. I mean, the plot of the movie is instigated by the fact that a shark, for absolutely no reason whatsoever, unless it's there developed a taste for metal or watched Jaws 2 recently decides to attack the seaplane and take such a big bite out of it that it sinks it in mere moments, that's absolutely preposterous. But if you think that's a silly thing out of a bad Jaws sequel, wait until you get later in the movie where the humans start fighting back against the sharks. As they start stabbing them, the sharks make roaring noises like the shark in Jaws: The Revenge, apparently in betrayal of all laws of nature and science, unless we found a new species inherent to bad shark movies. Now you must be wondering to yourself, if it doesn't have story or character or much shark action in it, well, what does it have? And the answer is not a whole heck of a lot, to be honest. It's most of the characters just bobbing around in their raft waiting for something, anything to happen, much like you are. And I guess in that way, it's a great sense of the character's psychology, because you too will also be deeply bored. In fact, it's more than halfway through, or at least 45 minutes, before anything of any real note happens in this film, especially shark-wise. It's so incredibly underwritten, and you're just left sat there watching these two-dimensional characters bicker irritatingly until they get to the 90-minute finishing line. What I will say is that Katrina Bowden does have a lot of experience in this kind of movie. She is a screen queen, she's appeared in the likes of Piranha 3 Double D, so she clearly has a step ahead of her Australian co-stars, but those co-stars, oh boy, the acting. It's like watching a gnarly episode of Home and Away. I'm surprised when the sharks eat them, they don't spit them back out again on account of them being completely wooden. There is such soap opera dramatics here that it's actually almost unintentionally funny to watch at times. This is especially true of the character of Goji, who is just written to be antagonistic for no real reason. There is exactly one moment where the character has a point, and that's when they're on the reef, they find the body, and Charlie suggests that they search for any survivors, and Goji tries to overrule him, saying, "No, I pay for this trip, I don't want to do that," and Charlie says, "Tough, I run the company," which I don't think that's how that works. But aside from that, every other time that Goji is in the movie, it's just there for cheap drama, like the fact that he's afraid of the water, so there's lots of moments where he's just stupidly clinging to a sinking object, or things like that. But the real subplot that Goji has that really just feels absolutely bizarre is that the moment that he arrives in the movie, he notices that the plane's cook, and I don't know why they have a cook for this, but the right-hand man, Benny, is making flirtatious eyes at Michelle right from the moment that they first glance, and he instantly picks up on it and is just casually hostile to Benny throughout the entirety of the movie. And it's just so obvious that this is being set up for something later on, and it just feels really forced. And this is one of the few plot threads that does actually have some kind of payoff, but not as much as it really should do. It should be a major dramatic turning point because it leads directly to another character getting killed, but actually the movie just kind of, again, shrugs it off. It's almost like the movie deliberately tries to avoid having any kind of plot. It wants to make Goji into a villainous character. It kind of looks like it's going in that direction, and then just doesn't follow through on it. It's so frustrating because it replaces it with absolutely nothing instead. And so you just sit around waiting for the movie to A, get going, and B, go through the predictable motions. You just sit there and you almost know exactly how this is going to play out, what order people are going to die in, and likely how they're going to die as well. It's so absolutely paint by numbers, and I do mean that. As I sat watching this movie, I started thinking about Blackwater Abyss, and this was before I realised it was from the same creative team, but it was reminding me so much of it, in that they're both Australian creature features that centre on secluded, isolated characters being hunted by some kind of creature. In Blackwater Abyss's case, it was a group of people trapped in a cave with a crocodile that incidentally you don't see very much of up until the very end of the movie, and most of it is filled with soap opera bickering and melodrama between the characters. Does it sound familiar? And so basically, I realised that they did just remake the same movie over again. They went, hey, Blackwater Abyss did well in cinemas because it was one of the few things out last year. Let's make the same movie again, but Mad Lib style. Replace cave with ocean and replace crocodile with shark, and boom, we've got a brand new movie. And they're both exactly the same as each other in the fact that they both feel like the plainest, most generic, dullest execution of this kind of movie, and they really don't have anything interesting about them aside from that connection and the fact they've got some unintentionally hilarious moments every once in a while if you can stick through it. Like, there's a moment where the characters who remain suddenly all huddle up in the middle of the raft when they realise that it's sinking, and then immediately smash cut to them all asleep, all leaning out the side of the raft, like they're trying to offer up their heads to the sharks. You immediately set that up and then contradict it. In the climax, there's a big kiss of life moment that genuinely and quite awkwardly looks like someone's fantasy coming to life on screen. It is so obviously being sexualized that I felt embarrassed for the actresses having to act that out, especially in the way that it's shot. What I will say about that climax is that it is actually fairly well done. There is some tension. You do actually see the sharks at the end of the movie, but it comes way, way too late for anyone to remotely care about anything that happens in it. By that time, most viewers will have totally tuned out, if not tuned off on Shudder, let's be honest. And so, basically, the end of the movie is all you even need to see. Just fast forward to the end of that, and you've pretty much got all the shark thrills that you would want from Great White. But the thing is, if you make me sit through 70 minutes of absolutely nothing and then 10 minutes of reward, that doesn't redeem the value that I spent watching this movie. Unless you're a die-hard shark fan, there is very little to recommend about Great White. Yeah, it's better than those direct-to-video shark movies you see on Amazon Prime with their punny titles, but that shouldn't be the baseline. The fact this has some semblance of production values shouldn't be how we judge a good shark movie, and the fact that it is really a damning statement on the subgenre, because otherwise this has virtually nothing going for it. No story, no characters, and virtually no sharks until the final 10 minutes of the film, when the filmmakers finally give you what you came here to see in the first place. Even in comparison to its predecessor, Blackwater Abyss, which was similarly plodding, Great White has whole expanses of absolutely nothing going on. You could literally watch any other shark movie you could think of. Jaws, The Meg, The Shallows, Open Water, The Reef, any of them, and they'll have more enjoyment and personality than this movie offers throughout the entirety of its running time. This is as bland as this kind of fare gets, and if you watch this, you'll be very quickly drowning in boredom. If you like this review, then throw me some chum at my Ko-fi page, or take a chomp at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.